Well, thank you to Pippa and Philip for organizing this conference, and to all of the speakers thus far. I think both the talks this morning have set up my talk very well, and we'll see what Philip says, because the project I'll talk to you about today is a social archaeology of inscribed objects. So sorry, Philip, I'm not talking about uninscribed objects, but that is for the future. So, Mesopotamia witnessed a long tradition of private individuals commissioning objects inscribed with dedicatory formula and depositing them in temples and other sacred places. These objects, often made from materials prized for their longevity, such as stone or semi-precious stones or types of metals, could display inscriptions which included a multitude of markers about the social identity of the person who commissioned the object. These markers include the name of the individual, and thus we can often determine their gender. They could include their profession, their kinship relationships, so their patrilineage, matrilineage, sometimes their children or the names of their children, and their extra kinship relationships, for example, such as the king. And you'll see examples of this where often people in sort of official capacities like to dedicate on behalf of the life of the sovereign. They could also include their place of origin and, of course, the particular deity or deities that they were choosing to dedicate to. The objects themselves also run the gamut: anthropomorphic and zoomorphic statues and figurines, weapons made of both stone and metal, vessels, beads, and plaques. The act of inscribing the chosen object and dedicating it within a sacred space thus materialized the individual's self-representation as a social actor within a given urban context, and perpetuated the individual's memory, ostensibly for time immemorial. So today, however, I'm going to talk about instances in which this constellation of information, so the inscription, the object type, the material and its manufacturing processes, and then of course with that we're also talking about all the people behind the scenes, so the scribe, the person actually inscribing the object, which might not be the scribe, it might be an artisan, and sort of the person even getting the raw resources to make these objects. There's this whole social network of people behind these things. So today I'm going to talk about how this message was altered or transformed either after deposition in the temple or during the manufacture of the object, so after the initial inscription. The second type of alteration is quite rare. However, the two case studies I will show today demonstrate how personal memory was not immutable or fixed, but could be reformulated depending on who was responsible for altering the inscribed object and the ways in which it was altered. The combined act of inscription and dedication did not constitute the final relationship between the human object and divine recipient, but rather formed one social or temporal dimension for an object that continued to sort of make memories beyond the original act of dedication. So before we get into the ways in which inscription and material are manipulated in Mesopotamian commemorative objects, I thought I should give a bit of background on this object category, their history of study, which has been rather piecemeal due to the fact that, one, they belong to non-royal individuals. So inscribed objects dedicated to temples by kings and queens are much better studied. And they've been traditionally studied in their constituent parts. And so Philip's talked very articulately about this problem. The inscriptions by Sumerologists and Assyriologists, and the objects, when they're talked about by archaeologists and art historians, to the point where it's only been a very recent phenomenon, and maybe not at all, as we learned today, that they're actually published together. So what is a commemorative object? This term is born from the research currently being conducted by a joint project between Cambridge and Uppsala University, which I'm a member of, called Memories for Life: Materiality and Memory of the Ancient Near Eastern Inscribed Private Objects. We are compiling an open access database of inscribed objects dedicated by private, meaning non-royal individuals, from the early dynastic I period, so roughly 2800 BC, for the first time of which there's evidence for such objects, through the first millennium BCE. As envisioned by its principal investigators, Jakob Andersson and Kristina Tsuparlapoulou, the study will be the first of its kind to encompass the material width and temporal depth of 3 millennia of ancient Near Eastern inscribed objects, with a particular focus on those by private individuals. Commemorative objects encompass objects that were inscribed and dedicated as a lasting memory of the person who commissioned them. The use of this term is meant to incorporate objects that did not exhibit a solely votive function, which is often assumed, and to include objects whose inscriptions are not clearly dedicatory in nature. An inscribed object, for example, may be found in a temple or burial context, but only include the name of the person, the devotee, and not that of the divine recipient. We are setting aside the term votive because it often implies a single exchange between the human and divine actors, whereas many of these objects seem to be set up in the temple or other contexts to activate an ongoing dialogue between the human and divine worlds, in which the person envisions representing themselves to the god or goddess for his or her or their lifespan and beyond. So the Memories for Life project is reevaluating these objects as complex tools of memory making, whose efficacy derived from the integration of material, object type, archaeological context, language, and writing system. And I won't get too much into the project. Feel free to ask me questions afterward, or if anyone wants to see our database, which is currently in process. I'm happy to show you. We're sort of up to about 1800 BCE, and my job is to fill in the next millennia and a half over the next year and a half, so we'll see how it goes. But this is just to give you an example of just sort of initial search of what we have so far, so just over 500 objects. And for those who aren't familiar with Mesopotamian periodization, I've highlighted in blue the third millennium, and then in red the ones that we have so far from the second millennium. And you can also sort of get a sense of the types of objects that are represented. So vessels, mace heads, metal weapons, beads, seals, which are sometimes dedicated to a god or goddess, statuettes, and so on. And then the varia column is sort of everything right now that we haven't fit into its own category. But this also includes things like cuneiform tablets. Often, and you'll see an example later on, which are copies of the inscription that was on the object. So we don't have the object itself, but someone copied it onto a tablet, and that's also in the temple, which is very interesting to think about when we sort of think about the transmission of the types of information in different media. And here, to situate you in space, a map of all the locations were inscribed commemorative objects dating from what I see as sort of 2800 to 1800 BCE have been excavated. And of course, this map will shift as we continue through the second millennium and into the first, not only as sort of new cities are settled or others sort of fall away, but also it's very dependent on what has been excavated and where it's been excavated for different periods. So that's something that we're constantly having to control for. So, if we get to the objects themselves. So stated today, I'm going to talk about instances in which commemorative objects have clearly been transformed after their initial commission. Thus far, despite the fact that these objects are far better published for their inscriptions than their archaeological contexts or material components, objects from the third millennium have only really been discussed archaeologically with regards to this transformation of memory. In her book, The Lives of Sumerian Sculpture, which focuses on anthropomorphic statues from the early dynastic period, so third millennium, in the Diyala region and other sites like Nippur in southern Iraq, Jean Evans has discussed both the death, so the burial or discarding of the statues, as well as their second lives, noting that in addition to hoarding and burial, statues could live on after the connection between it and the living donor was severed. For Evans, this severance occurs at the death of the human donor, which thus deactivates the inscription. It is no longer tied to an individual, and thus the concept of the image or representation of the person, Elan in Sumerian, Salmu in Akkadian, loses its particularity, its tie to an individual person. Evans writes that it is possible that, quote, too much emphasis is placed on the inscription when evaluating the life of a dedicatory object within the temple, because, she hypothesizes, the inscription ceases to function after a short time. She even postulates that the efficacy of the inscription may be lost as soon as the object enters the temple. And indeed, in addition to the fact, and again, Philip pointed this out, that there are many examples of uninscribed objects, including things like uninscribed anthropomorphic statues, as well as In the texts, we know that people are dedicating perishable items like food or textiles. So there's this whole world of dedicatory practice that is lost, the material is lost to us. There's a lot of archaeological evidence that these objects went on to have rich and varied lives, far beyond that of their donor and their donor's family. So, for example, all three of the objects shown here were excavated from the Inanna Temple at Nippur during the early dynastic period, and they were either reused or reconfigured after their first life. According to the excavators, the statues, and you'll see on the left and the right, were both sort of reconstructed from pieces of other statues. And one can see that the pieces are stuck together. So, for example, the feet here are, according to the excavators, from a different statue. They're kind of larger than his legs, and they're stuck on with bitumen. And in this case, you can see very clearly that the legs are a completely different type of stone. So again, these objects have been sort of reformulated. These may simply be attempts to fix a broken statue, but clearly the reassembling of the human form was acceptable in dedicatory practice. Parts of the statue are no longer part of the original person as conceived and activated in the first place. And in the middle is an example of a stone vessel that is, again, this one is inscribed, and it was sunk into a bitumen-coated platform within sort of the Holy of Holies in the temple, and seems to have been reused as part of a liquid installation. So there were other vessels also that were sunk in. The inscription, in this case naming an individual with the title of a temple administrator, a sangha, would have been hidden from view in this case, and so thus it's been argued. And you can see, not in this, but in the back, you can see the other side of the rim is completely damaged. And so the idea is that maybe it wouldn't function in its first case so much anymore and could be reused in this way. And the way it was sunk in, the inscription was no longer visible. And so this has been argued to show, this is reuse. I would add the caveat that it wasn't visible to the human view, because we also have to think about who is supposed to be reading these inscriptions, and it's the divine. Furthermore, there is evidence that statues were purposefully manufactured in a way for them to be disassembled later. Here one can see 3 statues exhibiting bored holes, original to the sculpture, through which attachments could have been used to keep the entire piece together. Again, Evans has argued that the fact drill holes were often, and here it's not a great image, you can see it in the torso, but they're also often at the neck, which means that the heads or the entire body could be replaced. And if we think about what is sort of individual about us, it's our face, right? So these heads could be replaced, showing that a new individual could be constructed from the old parts of another. In this way, those statues that were inscribed would have had an inscription that did not match the name or identity of its new donor. So throughout the course of my own research, I've been using these ideas as background on the reuse of objects to inform my own approach to them. And though I agree, entirely with Evans that the inscription can represent just one phase of the object's life cycle, and that we do tend to privilege the text over the material properties of the object itself, I also believe it is worthwhile to search for ways in which the inscription itself is what transforms the individual memory embodied in the object, beyond that of the initial act of carving into the material. Through the analysis of the inscription itself, we can learn a lot about how individuals negotiated their identity through the combination of text and image in both their contemporary practice and beyond. My exploration of the materiality of commemorative inscriptions is inspired and informed by the fact that we have a large body of evidence of recarving and appropriating inscribed objects in the realm of cylinder seals. Of course, cylinder seals are associated more with everyday transactions rather than with sort of the transactions or relationships with the divine, although, as I pointed out, seals are dedicated to gods and deposited in temples, as well as a very common type of grave good. And actually, we're not quite there yet, but in the Kassite period, so the second half of the second millennium in Babylon, we see, like Babylonia, we see a proliferation of seals as being dedicated to temples. And so it will be interesting to see if recut seals are also being dedicated to temples. So there are different object types But I think it's worthwhile sort of keeping them in the back of our minds, because like commemorative objects, they are inherently linked with a person's, or they can be, with a person's name, identity, and legacy, again, through the combination of text and image. There is a long tradition of recutting stone cylinder seals across the ancient Near East from the 3rd to 1st millennium BCE. Both the inscription, often naming the owner of the seal, and the image could be recarved in order to reflect a change in seal ownership as they're passed down through the generations, or altered to represent a new function, office, or even personal taste or the latest fashion of the owner. It has been demonstrated that seals belonging to officials related to the centralized institutions and royal power of Mesopotamia were more likely to have the inscription recut, as titles and relationships between officials and the palace were emphasized. On the other hand, people involved in long-distance trade were more likely to recarve the images on seals, and this has been recently discussed by Joanna Smith in a book on sealing practice. So her contribution to the book just recently came out a couple of months ago, illustrating a different way in which to express identity and authority in more mobile societies. So in this example, and this is from Smith's recent article, so in her article, she's provided a longue durée look at the practice of recarving seals and its implications for the expressions of authority. So in this example from Kition in Cyprus, Smith has shown how one can map the different stages of recarving. So you can see here on the right. In this case, the figures in relief are the latest iteration of the iconography, while the earlier sort of master or mistress of the beast motif had been sort of smoothed down so that they could carve this new image. The late 2nd millennium case of Babati, an official under the 2 or 3 period kings, also illustrates the ways in which we can trace a person's identity transformation through his or her or their seal. In the top example, we have the drawing of Babati's seal in which he describes himself as a scribe and servant of the king Andersson, who ruled from roughly 2094 to 2047 BCE. So, and this is sort of a common inscription for those that are servants of the king on their seals. So Andersson, strongman, king of Ur, king of the 4 quarters, Babati the scribe is your servant. In this bottom example, however, we can see the same seal but with the name of the king recut. Babati is now a scribe and servant of Shusin, king of Ur, again, king of the 4 quarters. This is particularly interesting because Shusin and Andersson were brothers, and there's evidence that they did not necessarily get along. And so when Andersson died, Shusin went on to campaign to erase his brother's memory. So yes, while it may be practical to now call yourself the servant of sort of the new boss in town, it also reflects sort of all of these political machinations that are going on in the background. So he was at least wise enough to realize that he had to change his seal. And here you can just see the shoe sign is the one that's been replaced for the new king's name. We then see that Shusin gifts Babati with an entirely new seal, as well as a slew of new titles, which I won't read out, but you can see that now he's not just a scribe, he's the household manager of the 2 queens, chief temple manager, and we see this much more. I mean, this is one of the most elaborate seals from the Ur III period. So again, this sort of shows, he was a savvy guy. He managed to kind of survive this political transformation and was rewarded for it. So we see that seals are a wonderful window into how identity, as manifest in stone inscriptions, could change in order to keep up with the real-time changes in one's life. And it is with this in mind that we can turn to commemorative objects and what their inscriptions, in addition to their contexts, can tell us about the fluidity of identity with regards to people and temple practice. So I'll give a couple of examples of objects I've been looking at, and then I'll go into kind of 2 case studies where we can see that the inscription itself has been changed. So the first example is of an entirely new inscription, and you can see it there on the back of the statue, carved into an older object. this fragmentary statue from the site of Susa, which is in Elam, which is today modern-day Iran, can be dated based on its style to the early dynastic 3A period around 2500 BCE. The inscription, however, dates to the Akkadian period, and specifically to the king Manishtushu, who was the king of Kish in southern Mesopotamia. It was dedicated on behalf of the life of the king by his servant Eshpum to a goddess. And so the inscription is about 250 years after the object. Eshpum or someone clearly found this statue, perhaps as part of a temple clear-out or when the temple was being refurbished, so ancient excavation of these temples, and decided that it was good enough for him. What's really interesting, though, is that he is keeping in line with the early dynastic tradition where non-royal people used white stone for their statues and royal individuals tended to use dark stone because they had access to more exotic materials like diorite. So he's keeping in line with this tradition that's been noticed for the early dynastic period. So in this case, this object is reactivated and bound to a new life through an original but much later inscription. In another example, we can see that inscriptions could maintain importance far, far into the future. In this case, we have a Neo-Babylonian tablet, so 6th century, that is a copy of an inscription found on a statue dating to the early dynastic period, so 2 millennia before. We no longer have the statue, it is lost. But when the Neo-Babylonian kings refurbished the temples, they often collected earlier objects deposited beneath the floors or in foundations. And in this case, it seems that a scribe, and here's the colophon of the scribe, collected and recorded the inscriptions. So we have, it's damaged with this partial inscription, so of the city Mari, so in what is today Syria, the merchant, son of Idin-il the scribe, son of Arshiaha of the city Sharameum, to Shamash he presented this statue. And then the colophon says, from the right shoulder of a stone statue, which in the debris of the Abarbar temple was found. So what we know the statue was from the early dynastic period, because the paleography of the inscription that would have been on the statue is preserved in the tablet. So they copied the paleography. So on the top, you can see a much earlier 3rd millennium paleography in Sumerian, whereas the colophon, so the part at the bottom, is in a Neo-Babylonian script and in Akkadian. So now I'll get to these 2 case studies of these private individuals and how they actually manipulated the inscription in order to say something new about themselves. So the first example, we have one of the few cases in which multiple objects dedicated by the same person survive. So one is on an anthropomorphic statue and one is on a plaque seen here. And they both belong to a certain fellow named Urakila. He's from the city of Adab during the early dynastic 3B period. This plaque, which would have been fastened to a wall in the temple, bears the name of the deity to which it is dedicated, Ninshabura. Urakila himself, his profession, a barber. So in this he calls himself a barber. He also includes the name of his wife and the name of his 8 children. So the plaque is dedicated to the goddess on behalf of the life of the entire family. This is quite common, having these plaques without visual imagery, especially for private individuals. So there's nothing particularly unusual about it, except for the fact that even by Mesopotamian standards, 8 children is a lot of children. And especially for private people, you don't normally see them. They'll often sort of name just and the children without the individual names, but here we have all of his children's names. So we now turn to his statue, and here you can see a really nice example of kind of the standard dedicatory formula. And again, Philip showed one in his presentation as well. So you see we have for Ninshubur, for the life of Bar and Henidu, the city ruler of Adab, Urakila, the city elder, dedicated this statue. As previously noted by Westenholz and Braun-Holzinger, the 7th line of the inscription, so what I've highlighted, do I have it? Yeah, here in red. The second box from the left has been altered. So the original cuneiform signs were smoothed down, and a new title, here, City Elder, was carved into the newly blank surface to replace the word for barber. And people who've been able to actually look at this up close say that you can see like the she sign, which would have been the end of the word for barber. So even from the photo that we have before us, we can see the sort of more shallow and less defined carvings of the sign in this box. And Brown-Holtzinger, in addition to sort of arguing for a transformation of the inscription, has also argued that there was a reworking of the figure's garment. And so you can see here, where I've had the arrow, you can see this sort of raised part projecting out of the back, which actually lines up to where his three-tiered skirt is carved in relief in the front. But in the back, there's sort of this line that's much lower, and then it's incised in kind of this less, so-called fine manner. I think Brown-Holtzinger said, maybe this change is related to the change in profession, but I don't see how that would work because he's been promoted and we have sort of a less nice version of the skirt. But again, it shows that these objects could transform from how they were originally conceived, whether it's the person itself dedicating the object and sort of having a plan in their mind, or sort of picking something out from a book or something like that. So, actually, I'll go back. So what does this mean, Great. So what does this mean? Without further analysis, and possibly because we don't have really secure contexts, and even if we did, this stuff is happening in the generation of a person. So it'll be really difficult to tell. So we can't tell if the costume change or the inscription change happened, sort of simultaneously, so contemporaneously after the original inscription was made, or if it happened after deposition. Jakob Andersson has argued that because the plaque, which has his title of barber, was an object that would be affixed to the temple architecture, it could not be removed. Whereas Urlakila could still access his statue, and thus could alter the inscription to reflect his promotion from barber to city elder. I'm not willing to go quite that far because we just cannot tell when this change was made from the object itself. And it is interesting, and it raises really interesting questions about access to temples. This also came up this morning, especially for a private person, someone who's not the king or a temple administrator, having access to material that's been dedicated. And this again speaks to this idea that the act of dedication is not the last say in these objects, that they are supposed to be having this ongoing dialogue. And so a change in inscription represents the fact that this guy now needs to represent himself to the divine and to his society in this new way. So either, whether it happened after the original inscription or after the dedication, it is a clear illustration of the inscription as well as the design of the object undergoing a transformation during its life. Though thought as to how this sculptural representation of the individual and thus his embodied memory was a sustained process, again, is something that we can talk about in the questions. In my second example, we have this bowl, and it has a most unusual double inscription. It also dates to the early dynastic period. In this case, the bowl was carved with a rather sort of formulaic inscription rendered in columned boxes, and I'll show you another close-up. So let's see, do we have it? Yeah. So on the right, we can see the original inscription in boxed columns. The inscription on the left, and thus in Sumerian, the first one to be read, says, "For the life of his wife and child, or children, he dedicated it." And when I say he, but it's interesting, the name is lost. And because it's Sumerian, it's not always, you can't really tell with gender. But what's interesting is in the next inscription to the left, we have Abranana, his wife, this is a female name, for "let him live," she also dedicated it. The second inscription is not in boxed columns, nor does it seem to be rendered by the same hand. Furthermore, the signs sort of drift up to the rim. It seems to be certainly an addition after the original inscription. And again, we have many examples of people dedicating for the life of their spouse, but it's always together. This is the only one of two cases in which we have both members of the marriage having parallel inscriptions. And just to briefly show you, of the 128 examples of carved stone bowls so far that we have from the third millennium, none are rendered in this way. The entire inscription is either boxed or left open at the top with the rim of the vessel acting as a limit to the inscription. So here we can see a creativity. So again, it's difficult to say whether this addition happened after the initial dedication in the temple. Because the first inscription mentions a spouse, it doesn't seem to be the case that this person got married and thus had to change his status in order to bring his wife into a relationship with the divine. On the other hand, she clearly wasn't part of the original conception of the object. So we can still see here choices that people are making, what aspects of their identity are important to communicate. So in this case, both the husband and then wife, perhaps exerting some of her own personal agency and wanting to be a part of this transaction, wanted to commemorate themselves and each other. So to conclude, Mesopotamians commemorated themselves, as I've talked about, through the combined meaning constructed from text, image, and archaeological context. Though the inscriptions were tied to the identity of the devotee through his, her, or their name, profession, kin and extra-kin relationships, the inscribed objects certainly possessed an afterlife or a second life beyond the initial act of dedication. In this case, the inscription could be altered, it could be appropriated, it could be ignored, and it could be recorded. New inscriptions created new identities and relationships as represented by the inscribed object. The first lives of the inscribed object, however, have been little studied beyond the inscription's content. So I argue that close study of inscriptions can inform us about the contemporary process of identity negotiation and self-representation, what I'm calling here commemoration, and the planning and execution of an inscribed object. They were not static objects, dormant between their dedication and so-called rediscovery, but continuously alive. So through a holistic analysis of the inscription with the object, we can see how people's choices are sort of continuously unfolding. So commemoration in stone was not set in stone, so to speak, but really was a constant process of negotiation. So thank you.